It's a pleasure to have Jan Michiel with us today. Jan Michiel is a very, 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 very good friend of mine. We know each other for more than 30 years for several reasons, and I am a fan of Jan from the beginning. Jan is a very intelligent, smart, patient guy who used to take care of everybody around him and all the social and personal and financing questions that he get a hold of. The idea of that webinar from here on will be to mix English speaking webinars with Portuguese speaking webinars. It sounds weird, at least, to have English speaking webinars to Brazilians, but in fact, the idea is to widespread. And the very name of that, Beyond Vision, is to speak on other things than vision in other languages also. Feel free to ask questions in Portuguese or in English. I can understand both. My English is not as good as Jan's. Jan can also understand Portuguese, but the idea is to speak in English. This episode is related to house, to houses, to how we live, to how we will live, to know some forms of different ways of living and to enjoy cities and to enjoy our liberty, different than we are used to, especially in Brazil, especially in big cities as São Paulo. And we will explore further a city that from the tourist point of view is so beautiful, so nice, so full of channels and boats and flowers as Amsterdam. Jan lives there. He's a Dutch guy forever, not in Amsterdam, but in the Holland. And he will bring us a very own questions from the country and from that way of thinking. I will open with some information, probably taking the past here to the moment and remembering that our most valuable dream was to have a house. So all the middle class people in Brazil wanted to have a house before anything. So I'm going to marry, I need a house. I'm going to go get a job, get a house. And that was the major thing. The present is not that simple. In fact, in the present, I have some numbers that came from the Fundo FICA that we will mention about, and I hope Renato, that is one of the founders of that Fundo, that fund that takes care of fair price houses in Brazil. Their number said that we have 7.99 million houses empty in Brazil and 6.3 debt in housings. So we have more empty houses than people needing houses. That's an absurd if you look at that. And we were in the beginning of this webinar talking about that. Well, how come? And my idea is that real estate became a currency. So it doesn't matter if it's being used to someone. That's a minor thing from that speculation point of view. Then we have the near and the long-term future. In the short term, we have low interest rate in Brazil, people buying and financing houses here for 20 years, co-housing, co-working, home office. And in the long term, we may have some movements from the city to city borders to nearby cities, retrofits in buildings, city urban plannings, movements to new areas. We have here in São Paulo all these destructions that we have in traditional areas. So it came from the Avenida Paulista to Faria Lima, then to Berrini, then to the new Faria Lima, and then now to the João Dias Bridge. So we move the very financing and the wealth and rich centers, and we just destroy and leave everything behind. And we will probably want to know if we want to stay as spectators, or can we act to change that and to bring it to some path that we agree. So we will talk about the real estate speculation. I want to ask about some historical path in the Netherlands, why the social housing was there so important. We may have some parallels in Brazil, why we don't speak too much about social housing. Oh no, we have some social programs, Minha Casa Minha Vida, BNH, some corporations that get a hold of that. Yes, but it's not, at least in my feeling, as strong and as mature and as linear and continuous as we have in the Holland. Okay, I spoke too much, and I want to open to Jan and start asking what is social housing and where does this come from in the Netherlands. Jan?
Thank you, Paulo. Nice introduction. Well, I'm working myself in a social housing organization. It is located in the region of Amsterdam. And the social housing has a very long history, but still it has. It is a very important part of the housing sector. You would not expect from a country where people think like, well, it's a rich country, and it is also, but still the social housing is enormous. It is still at this moment more or less of all the houses in the Netherlands, 30% of all the houses are social houses, so it is very big still. The history of the social housing goes back for something like 100 years. In these times, especially in the cities, there was a tendency of people going to the cities for work, but there were no houses. And then it was more or less in the 19th century, in the end of 19th century, more or less for speculation, that you had people renting houses to poor people and dividing the houses in one room or so, and they didn't maintain the houses. And in the beginning of the 20th century, I think it was 1900 exactly, that the government thought like we have to interfere in this horrible situation of many people living in the big cities. And then they started they created a housing act already in 1901. And the Housing Act contained certain things that municipalities could close houses when they were not taken care of very well. It was very important to put pressure on these speculators. Other thing was that the government gave some money to people who wanted to build social houses, a kind of a grant or a kind of subsidy. And that worked rather well, because also people of better offs, they saw also that it was an important thing to pick up. So they could get some money, and they created new houses. And in general, the driver of the government was not the central government itself, but it used to be the municipalities. But in general, the municipalities had all a color of political preference. Central government was a bit progressive to a certain extent, and in most cities they were kind of conservative. So it didn't start very well also in many cities. But there was one city which took the attention, and of course it was Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam there was a kind of an yeah, I don't know how to call it, but important for living in the government of the Amsterdam. And he was very active about it, and he used all the spaces there was in Amsterdam in order to start building social houses. And because of this, also other cities followed, more or less. For example, the neighborhood where I live, it is constructed more or less in 1910. And we had also a very big group of very poor Jewish people in the center of Amsterdam, and it was terrible living there. And the neighborhood they constructed here where I live now was intended to offer the people who live there better life and better housing. And that happened in many parts around the former center. And the city council, the city municipality was very much involved. And they even also, that was also a way of controlling more or less what they can choose to build. That they had a kind of a ground lease system. So all the new places, they bought it up, and then they were owner of it. And then more or less they leased it to other people, more or less, that you had to pay a yearly amount of that. And because of they were owning the ground, the municipality, they could also steer what was coming up on these areas. So that was also the reason why they could build so many social houses in this time. And this went on to, I think, to the 30s. Then you had a recession, and then it went a bit quiet. And then we had the Second World War, and there was, of course, a lot of houses demolished. And there was an enormous demand for houses after the Second World War, because the population was growing also after the war very fast. And then the government came back to the social houses to build up the country by creating a lot of houses, and they could use the government very well, the social organizations, in order to help to reconstruct the Netherlands for a certain well, in Amsterdam, they still are the used city met social housing in the Netherlands. I think in the 70s or the 80s, it was on something like 60% of the houses in Amsterdam were social. Oh. And still, I think it's something like 50% still social housing. So that's a lot. So I think that's more or less the history, and still the government considers the social housing. They want to change it a bit, but since well, it's also creating a bubble already something like 5-6 years. Mm-hmm. And what you see that they wanted to give the investors the space to build also social houses. But they are not doing it because they do not earn it. So the government is coming back to the social organizations to take it over, more or less.
Yeah. That would be my question. How does the government keep the program running? And you kind of answer that is most by having the houses, because giving incentives is probably hard to attract investors on that. But you also said that you have laws, and we have today some manifestation of the president regarding the expropriation of lands that were not being not having taken care of properly. Meaning, if you put fire on your land to take the woods out in a criminal way, the state may take that from out of you. And then the president became crazy about that. He said, no, never, never in my government. So private property is sacred, something like that. And you are mentioning that you have laws there in the Netherlands saying that if the house is not being used, it can be taken from yourself to the state. Are these laws, you think, more important than the market? Is the market more important than the ownership of the land? What's the balance to keep this program running?
Well, it is you cannot. The government cannot look the other side to the housing associations. They tried to do, because it was a kind of an other more liberal government last 10 years, and they tried to make the social house corporation smaller by trying to make laws that they were supposed to sell much more houses to make it smaller, and to let it go to the private people or to investors. But it took something like 6 years, and after 6 years, you see that the investors and the private persons are not taking it over. So there is already in a certain segment, that is not the lowest one, but more or less the segment of teachers or hospital people working in hospitals, or policemen, or this group. The fact is, Holland is also a small country, but a lot of people. So there is always a demand for housing. And when investors are not building, and what they are building, they only build very expensive places. So there is a shortage also for these mid-segment groups who cannot afford the highest level of rents. So the government is coming back to the housing associations again from, can you help us to construct? And the housing association, they are independent organizations. They are not part of the government itself. And they don't get direct subsidized anymore. It used to be like that, but since 20 years or so, they have to be independent. They have two things they get advantage of. And in general, they when they buy land or so, there's a kind of subsidy on that they can buy it a bit cheaper than it would be a commercial party. And a second one, and that's a bit my work to a certain extent, I'm responsible for financing the investments we are doing, and the state is guaranteeing our loans we have to draw. That means that we pay a much more lower interest than in the market. And these are the only things like we are more or less subsidized indirectly without receiving anything from the government. And that's also for the social housing organization a challenge in order to be sustainable, because the rents are not very high always, or not enough to continue. So we need also to do sales. And partly from the sales we get our money, but also we use it for new investments or renovations. And well, this goes well.
That's when I was in Amsterdam, you used to point me some social houses that it's very different than the social houses we have here. I mean, like beautiful buildings, with different kind of people living, and it's another view from here. At least the the ground view we have. You have uh, normal houses for social purposes, and you told me that you kind of spare some spaces and you direct spaces in the buildings in the very beginning of the buildings. Well, let's have this apartment will be a social apartment, that also, that also, that also, and the rest will finance that apartments. But like you mix all of them. First question, uh, is that true? I mean, is that only a impression that I had, that you have a mixture of social and no social, non-social housing? And second, what's the advantage on your point of view of having this mixture, of having social and non-social housing together? And the reason I'm asking that to you is that, as you know, we live in islands in Brazil, especially in the big cities where we are surrounded by walls and big security system. And right after the walls, we have poor neighborhoods. So I live in an area exactly like that. There's a social housing place nearby my apartment, and that apartment, that is an island in the middle of that. And I am not comfortable at all as a citizen, as someone that can walk in the neighborhood of my building. I am fine, but I cannot get out of the wall. So may you comment on these two aspects? So is that correct, that the social houses are the same as non-social housings? And what's the advantage of having that mixture for the citizen?
Well, it's also for housing associations a necessity, because they don't get direct subsidy also to survive also. So that means also that when they are constructing houses, it needs to be part of something like 50% or 60% social, and you need something like 20% a bit higher rents. It doesn't mean that it is the highest rent you can ask, but it's also meant to be for mid-segment people, and something like 20% for sales. And that's more or less also our yeah, how do you say that, earning model to a certain extent. We need this 20% of sales in order to pay also the investments for the social rents. About your question about whether people live well with each other. Well, it's already a kind of a long tradition also. It is more or less, I think, something like 100 years already that people live together. Of course, you have the better quarters and you have the worse quarters, but in general, there is not much place also everywhere. So it is sometimes that the cities, they cannot expand except from in the city itself. So there is a kind of a tendency to mix also because of that. And the prices have been always kind of high also. So the houses which are created, they in general in the cities itself, they are also not very big. So the sizes are smaller. And that makes it also maybe that people feel like being mixed. And about the safety, for example, well, it is, of course, there is also some criminality, but well, we do have, because of this mixing in the Netherlands, more or less. When you compare it with France or UK, it is much different. There really you have some ghettos. And in Holland, you do not really have ghettos or banlieues and it makes it, I don't know for sure, but you don't feel afraid when you walk through the cities in the Netherlands. And I don't know, I cannot prove it, but it looks like that because of the mixing, it goes better than you segregate it, because it's already an psychological barrier to enter the other neighborhood, even not knowing whether it is dangerous or not. Mm-hmm. But yeah, when it is, yeah, then you don't go there. Well, I see it. You have some trends also to have this mixing getting less, because also in Amsterdam you have the trends, especially in the center, that the prices are getting so high also, that there is much more properties sold for high prices, that there are kind of new people coming in. And when we talked before the session, I said already, you have kind of people, they are coming in, they are not inhabitants, but they are speculators. And they're moving out when they think they have the right price. And that is also happening, and it is very strange also during Corona that the prices are going up higher. And you see it also in my neighborhood. It used to be said as a bad neighborhood in Amsterdam, but I never experienced that it was a bad neighborhood. But when people said it, because there were something like 60% foreigners or migrants living in the neighborhood, and because of that they considered us a difficult or bad neighborhood. But I never experienced it as a bad neighborhood. I liked it also because it was a strategic position of you could park your car there always, and being close to the nice shops, because it was surrounded by better neighborhoods. But since 6 years or so, it starts to be a gentrification in the neighborhood, and well, it attracts same kind of people, so the diversity goes down, and I consider that also as less nice of the neighborhood. But
yeah, I wanted you to speak about that word that we are getting used to. At least some of our audience is starting to listen that for the first time. Gentrification. What is gentrification, and how can the state take some care of that? What are some mechanisms to overcome these? Is it possible to overcome these? You just mentioned that gentrification is a kind of homogenization of the neighborhood, of the people. And well, it's also my feeling that if you have a mix, you are much safer. And not only that, it becomes much more interesting to live there. So you have different cultures, foods, sounds,
yeah,
voices, faces. But gentrification is something that we probably have here. We just don't have this word. What's gentrification?
well, it's more or less that people who did not used to live in certain neighborhoods, and they are entering the neighborhoods with a lot of money. And when you have a kind of a certain percentage of people living there, you see that other kind of shops are arriving in the neighborhoods. They are the trendy kind of shops. And when they are starting to get there, you know already, then it goes fast. And that attracts more people who can pay a lot. Mm-hmm. And in Holland, there is a kind of a difficult balance between the poor and the rich, that the tax are kind of high in order to pay also the welfare state. But you have also to support more or less the rich people. And they are also compensated by, for example, buying houses. So when you have a mortgage or so, you can deduct it from your tax. And when you have a big house or so, you pay more interest, and you can also deduct. And they also created, in order to support the richer people also, is that the parents, they could give the children, when they were buying a house, a certain amount of a lot of money, also tax-free. And that are kind of things which can be good when there is a crisis, but you see that it is now a crisis anymore in the housing sector. It's going very well. But these incentives, they are still there, and they are disturbing this market to a certain extent, because they make the prices even higher, and they are also pushing this gentrification even more. So in order to stop this, I think, also I see it in my neighborhood, that the kids are not really looking for the houses, but the parents are, because they are giving this 100,000 euros tax-free. And well, it might be a good incentive when it is really a bad time, but you have to stop this in order to get these prices rising, and also this gentrification, I think, to make it less than that. And well, there is in Amsterdam also kind of tendency. It is a left government, and they have kind of rules of what is supposed to be built on new places, that it always needs to be 40% social and 30% mid-segment, and then you have 10% high segment and 20% or so for sales. So that is all in all the places where there is still land to build. It's the rule. And well, that is also kind of a way of influencing this development. But well, it means also, to a certain extent, when you have to build 40% social in the other regions, there is space also to live, and so it can be that they get the people from the center. They are going away there, and they are going to the new places. In general, it is very important when you want to have an influence on the real estate, that the governments are active in it, because you have some ways to steer this. And it can by subsidize, it can by support, it can by many things, but it is very important. It was already important 100 years ago, but I think it's still very important. The neoliberal parties, they try to give it back to the market, but after 6 years, you see already that the market is only interested in the highest yields of the real estate, and they are not really interested in the other parts, as long as it sells. When the high yields are going bad, and it can be that crisis comes back because of Corona afterwards. Because in Holland and in Europe, the most companies, they are supported still, so you don't see yet a lot of unemployment or so. But when the money is gone, then they cannot support the companies anymore, so it will be worse the coming times, and maybe that has some influence on the gentrification and the rise of the price. But you never know, even in bad times, when the demand is high and the supply is very low, well, then the market does the work.
Yeah. What's the difference on price for like a rent in social and a rent of a non-social house? You know that the FICA fund in Brazil, and we may explain that that's a very nice concept on social housing, on fair price rents. Let's say it's not social housing, it's fair price rent. They take old apartments in the center of the city. They rebuild that in a very nice way from an architectural point of view, and then they rent that to the people that use it to live there for a fair price. What is the difference on renting, on the renting price for social housing and a non-social housing? And second, I was told that you have a method of points on having on putting a value on your own house if you want to rent it. So it reminds me some kind of control over renting. We don't have anything like that in Brazil. So if you want to rent, if you want to rent your house for 10 times the market price, and market means who rented that right before of me, you can try. And if you find someone willing to pay, okay, that the deal we're gonna close. You're gonna close the deal. But I was told that you have some limits there. You have some kind of references there. May you explain that? So the price of the social housing and that limitation. And if you want to comment on the FICA fund, I'll be happy, or we will take that question afterwards.
You can consider more or less 3 segments in the Netherlands. We call it the lower side, the social part, and you have the mid segment and you have the high side. And you can say more or less that the average for social housing is something, even in Amsterdam, something like €500 per month. And then you have the mid segment. You can also consider that can be more or less fair pricing. It is lower than the market, but it is sustainable more or less. And that is considered something between €700 and €1,000. And when you go to the free market, it is supposed to be between 1,000 and 2,000 or so, something like that per month. But in Amsterdam, this part between 1,000 and 1,500 is very little. It is more like 1,500 to 2,000 or even more than that. Well, according to this point systems, you had in the past also in Amsterdam that you had neighborhoods or streets that were labeled to be rented as social houses, even for a private owner. When it was labeled as a social housing, you were considered as renting it for social housing. And when it is a social housing, then there is a system of points. And the points they make, like it is more or less, these points are connected to the quality of the house. When the quality is much better, then you have more points, and then you can get more rent for social housing. But there is a limit to how far you can go, what considered as social. So it used to be that in the past, because that's not anymore, this point system still exists, but only for real social housing places. But for a private person who had such a house, which was labeled as being social, then you could not ask a market rent, for example. So you had to stay below a certain level. And but when you are not having a house which is labeled as social houses, you can ask prices whatever you want. It is not connected to this housing, this point system. It is especially for social housing itself. And in general, there are still some private persons who have some social houses. Even I think some 10 years ago, there were also investors buying social housing because pension funds or so, in bad times, it is you always have your rents more or less. The lower the rent, the better it is to a certain extent for your continuity receiving the rents, because the higher yields are also more risky. And but they also had other ideas with that, because when you have a mutation of a house, and the house has points which are above the limit of social housing, then you can, when there is a mutation going, as long as the renter is in the house, you cannot do anything with the price. But when these points are above the social limit, then you can ask more. And you can also sell, for example, the house. And that was what the private investors attracted. So they were not really only for the rents, but they were also waiting for selling it, or when or to ask higher rents, for example. And these points, they are based on the quality. When you have a nice kitchen or so, then you get more points. And in general, what we are building, also a social association, sometimes also for the higher segment. In general, the houses, they are more or less the same, but the kitchen is better for the higher rent. But in general, there are not a lot of difference or so, and they are also in the same elevator, or not separated elevators or so. But yeah, that's more or less answer.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that initiative that our friend Renato started, the Fundo Fica, that they renovate buildings, and that's I'm sure we are still in the beginning of that. But what connected me from there to you is mostly the non-direct governmental interference, or so like you said, we are self-sustainable. We build houses, we sell houses. We kind of do what the government doesn't do. That sure you are foreseeing for some limitations invested by the government also. And here in Brazil, I doubt that the government would put any money in that fund. But it's interesting to see that movement that goes with the government, or in spite of the government. So even if the government is kind of not aligned with that, the society can do things, and the society is responsible for their own sake, fate, path. How do you foresee that path? Do you think we have life without government, the social life?
Well, there will always be life, but I think the initiative is a very good initiative, because that's also how it started. I think to a certain extent in Holland 100 years ago. It was in the beginning, it was not direct interference of the government itself, but you had already some initiatives like this, like people are trying to make the circumstances better, also for the housing. And when you're about the fair price to a certain extent, and as you compare it with our sector in the Netherlands, well, I classified that there are kind of three kind of rents: the social one and the mid segment. You can say more or less in our country that the mid-segment rent of 800 more or less is the fair rent to a certain extent. It is a sustainable amount. You do not make a loss out of it, and you offer people who cannot pay the market prices houses, and that's also very important. And especially this mid segment is also sometimes forgotten, because it is in general most countries it is or the poor ones or the rich ones, and the ones in the middle, they are forgotten. And they are very important also for the structure of neighborhoods, people, because they keep the neighborhoods alive. And also these initiatives of renovation in neighborhoods, when people see that, that's also very good development. That makes kind of optimism, and especially when you're doing that in bad neighborhoods, that makes the people who are living there more self-confidence, and it has a very positive effects, I do think. And whether it is sustainable when a government is against this kind of initiatives, yeah, it is very difficult, but even very important that it stays like that, and try to influence the people more broader than it is nowadays, I think. But it's a very good and very important initiative to go further with that, and maybe slowly can influence political parties or whatever to have some more government influence for that. But as long as it is not there, you cannot do something else than that, and that's very good, I think.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the states, Biden and Trump. Do you foresee any movement towards the social state of wealth with this election? Do you think there will be some investment in that on opposition to speculation and to free market in the very United States of America? Because we, Brazil, kind of oscillate between as a social country towards, I wouldn't say Europe, but more not socialist, but democracy, a social democracy, or free market. And now we are kind of free market, but we have opposite signs from the very government. What do you foresee in the States, and how do you think that will or will it reflect in our countries or markets?
Well, it's kind of difficult to see what's going on there, because it is already for some long time that the society is very divided in the US, and the other side, under different kind of color of presidents, the market was the center of it. But I think, yeah, Biden cannot change this in a term of 4 years. But what's very important in some other kind of presidency, like Clinton and even Obama also, they were also, they didn't have a very bad relation with the financiers, the banks. But what made them different than other presidents was that they tried to set up certain social things. For example, for the health situation in the US, like Clinton has tried to make a kind of an insurance for health for all Americans. Obama tried it also, but they did not really succeed it. And it's already very important that these kinds of presidents, and Biden, maybe he's also going to try it. It doesn't have to be directly the market, but what's very important is the primary necessities of people, and that's health and living. And that is, Clinton and Obama tried maybe the health, and maybe it's good for Biden to focus on the housing. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, the crisis 20 years or 15 years ago, in the meantime, was created by some rules for the market to a certain extent. The crisis started that there was a rule that the banks could sell mortgages to poor people, knowing that they could not pay after 5 years. So they didn't have to pay the first 5 years rent, and after 5 years they had to pay the rents from the 5 years before, but the doubling of the rents. And the system was that when they couldn't pay, they could kick the people out and they could sell the house. And that was the earning model of many banks. But they didn't know, or they didn't consider that the prices could also go down. And that happened. So the prices of the houses were then lower than the mortgage. So they went wrong. And that was the start of the crisis. It affected the whole world. And it was connected to something what is primer to life, to have a house. And it is, it was a very kind of strange law that banks were allowed to such a kind of initiative. So this kind of examples makes that you can do some things to make it better, even not saying goodbye to the market, but there are some things to cut off a little bit, to make it less open, to make it less wild market actives. And that's the task of the government, and I hope that Biden tries to start there in the housing, because when you're traveling through the States, I have done it several times. There are very nice, good things, but what my struck was the poverty, for example, also in the countryside, but also in parts of cities. And you have to consider that many million people live in poverty also there, and 40 million people cannot insure themselves. It's always an example in the US of freedom or what you can do, but it has also a negative side, and that's not many times considered as people look to the US.
Oh, yeah. There's a word in Portuguese named bom senso, and you know that word. Bom senso is something that I was looking for that word in English. I didn't find it. So you is one of the guys that has more bom senso that I know of. And you just put together that the subprime crisis in very, very, very nice and simple words. We saw tons of movies and read tons of things, and I probably never saw some so simple, direct, and concrete explanation of that. And it's pretty much a wild market bet. And as you mentioned, to have freedom is very good for someone who has assets, but to have freedom is nothing for one that doesn't have anything. So it's not fair to speak about these meritocracy or something like that. If in these issues with a huge inequality as life or housings and so on. So it's very, very important to speak about that in that very simple and direct way. Well, I will mention that me and Ian, we know each other very well because we are brothers-in-law, and we have a very keen connection, a very nice connection from Eva. And I just want to, I want to thank you very much for your time, for your patience, for your bom senso, for the openness you have in that calm way that you are to offer us, and that will for sure open some minds and let us to see what our eyes won't see in a very trivial and a very normal way, so to see beyond the view. And I want to open to you to the final comments, whatever you want to say. Please feel free.
Well, I like it a lot to do this. It was a kind of a surprise that you are doing this also outside the medical sector, and that's very good, I think, also of this initiative. And yeah, having some connection with Brazil, I have already for some long time, but also to say something from my background in my work. To bring it a little bit to Brazil is also a nice opportunity to have to do so. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jan. See you. Try to see you soon. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.